Om Asato Ma Satkamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravir Mageti Rudrayate Takshinam Mukham Te Namam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. So welcome everyone. This is the first class, the new text that we are starting, the Gita. The Gita itself is not new, of course, but this is a fresh study of the Gita. And no matter how often or how many times we may have studied this book before, every time we read it, every time we study it, it always has something new to teach us. So, this being the first class, we will begin with the actual text of the Gita next week. But I think there are some important things we need to know before we begin the text itself. The first part is clear. The Gita is a part of a larger text, the Mahabharata. It's one of the two great epics in the tradition, the other being the Ramayana. Many of you may be familiar with the Mahabharata story. Few people have read it in the original. If you read it in the original, it's at least 100,000 verses. And then the translations would run into several volumes. But if you want a more compact version, we have a small little book, relatively speaking, of the Mahabharata written by Rajagopalachari, a great statesman and intellectual. This book was probably written sometime in the 50s or 60s. But it's a very interesting story. So the Gita forms a section of this book. And just imagine 100,000 verses in that book, and the Gita is a relatively smaller text of about 700, not about, exactly 700 verses. So there is a chapter in the Mahabharata called the Bhishma Parva, and it's in that chapter, in that section really, chapters 25 to 43 of the book constitute what we today know as the Gita. Now, the Gita itself is, we know it, of course, as the teaching of Krishna to Arjuna. But in the body of the text itself, it is actually a dialogue, a conversation that occurs between Sanjaya and Dhritarashtra. Dhritarashtra was a king of the Kauravas, and it's a conversation. So Sanjaya is the one who narrates what happened on the battlefield. And Dhritarashtra then, that narration was then put into words by Vyasa, who then passed it on to Vaishampayana, who passed it on to Janmejaya, and that's how it has come down to us today. The Gita itself, as I said, has 700 verses. Out of these 700 verses, Dhritarashtra, the blind king, has only one verse, the very first one. That's the only time Dhritarashtra's name comes. Sanjaya, who is narrating the story, there are 40 verses in the text attributed to Sanjaya. There are 84 verses attributed to Arjuna. So not all 700 verses Krishna is the speaker. So 1 to Dhritarashtra, 40 to Sanjaya, 84 to Arjuna. And if any one of you is a mathematician here, you will know how many verses remain for Krishna. But to make it easy, 575 verses out of 700 are actually when Krishna is doing the talking. Now, there's always, when scholars read a book like this, and when devotees and spiritual seekers read a text like this, there is always some differences in the way they approach a text. I remember years ago when we were studying this text called the Panchadashi, and I was in Chennai in southern India, And the Pandit who was teaching us is a very traditional Orthodox Pandit. And so the very first question I asked him with Panchadashi was, when was this text written and by whom? And his response was, what does it matter? So that's what I mean by these two different approaches. Those of us who are now kind of brought up in this more contemporary education system, when we read about some ancient text, the first thing is, how many years old? Which century it is? Who wrote it? How do we know that person who wrote it? All these kind of questions come. And the more traditional approach is this. What this book says, is it in harmony with what the Upanishads teach? Because the Upanishads or the Vedas are seen as having no human authorship, that they are the revealed text. Their authority is unquestioned. So if this book says something that is in harmony with what the Vedas say, and is in fact helps us to understand the Vedas better, then this book is authentic. Doesn't matter even if it was written yesterday. Or if a book which may not be in harmony with the teachings of the Upanishads may be 50,000 years old. Just because it is ancient, it doesn't necessarily become more authentic. So that's the more traditional approach. So the timing of the Gita is questioned, and scholars have come with many, many different possibilities. Could be 3,000 years old, 3,500, and there is no way, one way or the other, to verify this. So pick up any number that you feel comfortable with. It's also, the question is about when the Gita was taught by Krishna to Arjuna, and when was it put into the form in which we find it today. There are some people who believe that the Gita is a kind of a later composition put inside this Mahabharata text, that it's kind of an interpolation. But Swami Vivekananda said that there is nothing to support that view, because the teachings that we find in the Gita are not unique only to the Gita. Those teachings, those insights can be found spread throughout the Mahabharata. So it is in complete harmony with the teachings that are found in the rest of the book itself. One other question, of course, is, does the time of the Gita matter? Whether it is 3,000 years old or 2,000 or whatever, does it matter which place it was given? Does it matter who taught it? So Swami Vivekananda kind of raises these questions in a talk he gave on the Mahabharata. And there are some genuine questions can be asked about it, because if you look at the setting, most of you are familiar with the basic story. Essentially, it's the Mahabharata is a story of a dynasty, a clan, called the Kuru dynasty. And it's a very long story with lots of interesting things happening. And just as we can find in the society in which we live today, even in the 21st century, but even within our own circles, our family and friends and so on, being a story of a family, it has all the ups and downs of the family. There's wonderful instances of love, friendship, understanding, sacrifice, but there's also all the negative sides about it. There is this suspicion, there is anger, there is fight, there is exploitation. It's a very good replica of the kind of society we might find at any point in history. Because sometimes there is a feeling, or people do say, oh, what is the condition of the world today? And then we look upon some past time as a kind of a golden period. Oftentimes, people would have heard this in their own families, their parents and grandparents saying, oh, during our time, things were different. It was like wonderful. And now what has happened? And then probably they have heard the same thing from their parents and their grandparents. And the reality is this. Yes, sure. In history, there have been some good, peaceful times, not entirely peaceful, relatively peaceful, and some really difficult times. But overall, the general tenor of the world in which we live today and the world as it has been even in past centuries, and any student of history will know that, it's not changed a lot. There are good people, there are bad people, there are very nice, inspiring things happening in the world. There are also things which are disgusting that are happening. And this we see is in the time of the Mahabharata as much as it is today. And that's why one of the teachings that Swami Vivekananda gives in his Karma Yoga was whether the world itself will ever change its basic character can be questioned. He compares it to a dog's curly tail. No matter how often you straighten it, it's going to curl up again. But, and this is important, if we try to help set things right in our own personal lives and in the lives of those around us, and if we do it selflessly, if we do it in the spirit of Karma Yoga, then the benefit we get, that is not temporary. So a real change, an irreversible, permanent change for the better is possible in our personal lives. But whether that will change the world permanently, doubts can be raised about it. There are people who do believe that eventually all evil will go away and only good will remain. And that can be a good motivation power. But it can also be somewhat depressing because no matter how hard you work, and then you find, oh no, nothing much has changed. Was it all just a waste of time and energy? And so it's necessary that just as there are destructive, evil forces in the world, we also need good, positive forces. So this simultaneous presence of good and evil in the world will continue. And we need good people trying to do good things to counteract the effects of bad people doing bad things. And this is necessary. But eventually, what we do find is that if I continue to do good in the right way, then I can benefit from that. So Swami Vivekananda's the talk in Karma Yoga is titled, "We do good to ourselves, not the world." In other words, even when we think we are helping the world, we are really, if we do it selflessly, we are helping ourselves more than the world. To give a simple example, if you have a hungry person come to you and say, "I'm hungry, give me food." And so you then feed that hungry person. You have done something good. Now, how much good have we done? Clearly, I have reduced one hungry person in this world, which is nothing. But that person is going to be hungry again after 10 hours. So I've done some good, but that good is not like a permanent good. On the other hand, if that same act of feeding the hungry, I've done it completely selflessly, without expecting anything in return, without even expecting gratitude, without even expecting that the person should say thank you. If that person, after I feed that person, if that person were to even abuse me, that I shouldn't feel, oh, why did I help this person? This person is so terrible. But I will continue to do good irrespective of whatever response I get. If I am able to do that, then that will purify my heart. That is called Chitta Shuddhi. So when my heart is purified, that person will become hungry again after 10 hours. But the purity of my heart that I have acquired, that is mine forever. That will not go after 10 hours. So if I work in the spirit of Karma Yoga, none of us need have that ego that I'm helping the world, I'm doing something better, because in reality, we are actually helping ourselves. But, and this is the tricky part, Now that I have said this, next time when you're doing something good, if you think, oh, I'm really doing good to myself, then there's a problem, because then your ego has come up. So that's the thing. Really, we are helping ourselves. But when you are helping someone, don't think about the self at all, because then it would not be selfless. So we need that heart to feel the suffering of other people, to help other people, but do it selflessly without expecting anything in return. So that's the idea. So does the timing of the Gita matter? And the answer is no. Swami Vivekananda, as I said, raised this question because, first of all, this set of cousins who ultimately, towards the climax of the story, come to a situation in their lives where they have to fight. There is a lot of injustice being done, and to restore justice, the good guys, the Pandavas, and their cousins are called the Kauravas. So there are 100 brothers, and these are 5 brothers. And now situation has brought them on the battlefield. Pandavas represent the forces of good, Kauravas represent the forces of evil. But they are cousins, they are related. And the different family loyalties and the commitments each of them has made over the years, it's really a family that's divided. And so that is where we are now. The two sides, they have mobilized their allies and soldiers, thousands on this side, thousands on the other side. It's about to begin. And it's called Dharma Yuddha. It is a battle that is done with the supposed following of Dharma. In other words, they just don't go in the middle of the night when everyone is asleep and just bomb them. So they had a kind of a formal opening, the starting of the war. In fact, as we read in some of the accounts, the war would begin a little after sunrise. And then the war will stop for the day at sunset. And then each would retire to their camps and then wait until the next morning. So they had certain rules. Now, not everyone followed the rules. A lot of rules were broken. But at least the rules, unless you have the rules, how can you break them? So they had the rules. And the rules were also broken now and then. But that's why it is called Dharma Yuddha. So these two armies have come facing each other. And it was not like this war was a big surprise to anyone. This was building up for weeks and months. So each of them knew who was on the other side. But sometime we might see that in life, we might kind of know things in the abstract, but when they actually happen, it's a very different experience. For instance, we have read in the books and in histories and things like earthquakes. Earthquakes happening in other parts of the world. We see photographs, we see how people are affected, and we kind of think, I know what it means to be an earthquake. These things are going to shake, and I have to be safe, I need to go out into the open ground, and what are the precautions we might take. All these things are kind of known. Sometimes the city will issue warnings. In abstract, intellectually, we understand. But actually then being in that situation, when really everything around you is shaking, that's a whole different thing. Even though no matter how much we may have thought about it, imagined it, actually being there could be a completely eye-opening experience. And that's what happened to this Arjuna, the protagonist here. He is one of the best archers in the world of his time, and Krishna is his charioteer. So they have all assembled, the contests are blown, that's the kind of official beginning of the war. And then suddenly at the last moment, Arjuna says, I want to see who is on the other side. Oh, come on, he knew who there was on the other side. It was not a surprise. But right now, being there, it suddenly says, I actually want to see who I'm fighting. And that's essentially the story begins there. And so the question that often gets asked is it even possible that when the war is about to start and Arjuna says, I want to see. And then suddenly he says, oh, it's my own uncles, my grandfather, they are on the other side. I can't fight with them. I can't kill them. I'm not going to do it. It's almost like you have kind of prepared for an event, made all the preparation. At the last moment, somebody saying, I can't do it. And then the teaching that Arjuna gave is now come to this total of 700 verses. And those of you who have tried to recite the Gita know that no matter how fast you do it, it's going to take at least an hour or so, probably more. And so the question is, with thousands of soldiers on both sides, raring to go with their horses and elephants and their weapons and all of that, and suddenly now Arjuna says, I can't fight. And then Krishna says, okay, let me now speak with you. And this discourse starts. First of all, it just seems so unrealistic. What were these other soldiers doing when this elaborate teaching was being given? Secondly, they didn't have any taping mechanism. Who was there taking notes of what Krishna told Arjuna? Where did this fight occur? I mean, if you go to India today, in northern India, they do show, there is a place called Kurukshetra, and they often identify that place is where this battle occurred. So there are places which people say historically that is where it happened. There are also now some astronomical or astrological calculations have been done about when exactly this teaching was given. And they sometimes identified that the date comes sometime in the lunar calendar, usually sometime in December. They call it Gita Jayanti, it's celebrated at. And so there are these place, time, when it was given, how it was given. But the question is, does it matter? And that's the kind of a question that we, before we even begin the study of the Gita, have to ask ourselves. It's possible to be skeptical about and raise all these questions. And what Vivekananda said was this. The teachings of the Gita, they are authentic, first of all, because they are in complete harmony with the Upanishads. But secondly, and even more importantly, these teachings are not simply some theoretical construct done by some PhD professor, that these teachings, people who have followed these teachings and practiced them, have actually transformed their lives. People have become saints, people have become enlightened as a result of not only studying the Gita, but actually living according to these teachings. So it's this direct evidence that following these teachings, one's life can be completely transformed. We can become saints if we read it. That is what makes it authentic. And therefore, it doesn't matter whether the Gita was taught in December or in the month of March or September. It doesn't matter whether it was taught in northern India or in southern Australia. Time, place, none of this matters. And so that's the approach. Swami Vivekananda speaks about it. There is a book in which everything that Swamiji spoke about the Gita have been compiled together. I think we have copies of it in the bookstore if you would like to take a look. So everything that Swamiji said about the Gita is a fascinating read in itself. So Swamiji in that portion says that sometimes people have even questioned the historicity of Krishna. Adorable as Krishna's figure is, some people say, how do we even know whether Krishna is actually a historical figure or just a part of an epic, just like a big nice story? And there are several things that can be said about it. The first thing is, as Swamiji points out, the teachings of the Gita do not depend on the historicity of Krishna. Now, Krishna is historical according to what most people feel. But even if someday someone were to prove and say there was no such person as Krishna, there was no such person as Rama, that would not make the teaching of the Gita any less authentic, because its life transformative power does not depend on the historicity of these great figures. And that's the great strength of Vedanta, is that it has a lot of personalities, amazing people, inspiring figures, and we can learn so much from them. But the truth, the essence, the teaching, the life does not depend on the historicity of any of these people. And so there is a place for personalities, and yet not a dependence on personalities, that the principle always stands higher than the person. So this is something to be kept at the back of the mind as well. What makes the Gita? Now, speaking of Gita, there are two ways we can look at the Gita. Two ways actually we can study the Gita. One is to study it as a historical document, and the other is to study it as a scripture. Now, as a historical document, clearly the context becomes important. Just what I very briefly mentioned earlier about when was this Gita taught, in what context was this teaching given, what are the references to other incidents that occurred in the Mahabharata, how does it relate to the contemporary society of those days. All these questions can become relevant if we study the Gita as a historical document, which is fine. But it's also possible to look and study the Gita as a scripture, as a Shastra, in which case you can still look at the context, but the context itself would not matter much. It's just possible to just look at the Gita itself and the teachings it gives, which really transcend any place, time, and societal considerations. In other words, if Gita was so tied up in the society that was 3,000 years ago, we might today then ask, what relevance can it have in the 21st century when the world has changed so much? But because the Gita is not tied to a particular place or a particular time, we are able to find its relevance even today, because the Gita deals not with these changing values in society, but some of these eternal, unchanging values in our own heart. And that's why the Gita becomes relevant even today. Swami Vivekananda said that is the best summary of the Vedic teaching, best summary of Vedanta. So, many of you who are as Vedanta students know that the basic text in Vedanta are the Upanishads, which are the philosophical portion of the Vedas. Now, these texts, the Upanishads, are so ancient, so old. They were not like books written by some person. They are actually the spiritual experiences of these Vedic sages, which are, it's almost like notes that somebody might take. The revelations that occurred to these sages and just these kind of notes. So they're often very abstract. Oftentimes it's not possible to kind of even know the connecting link, because these are just the revelations. That is why the sages in Sanskrit call mantra drashta. It was not that these things in the Upanishads were logically taught by these sages. The sages were not professors. What they, in their meditations, these were the things that they were revealed to them. Mantra drashta means these mantras of the Veda mantras were revealed to them in their meditation. And so, what was revealed to them, they shared it with their students. And in those days, a lot of it, nothing was written down. This was way before things were being written down. So it was just passed on orally from one generation to the next until they reached a point when things began to be written down. So these Upanishads, because they have these kind of abstract portions, to read the Upanishads, read the Gita, we often need the help of commentaries. And these great acharyas, today we know the names of some of the most prominent ones, Shankaracharya, Ramanuja, Madhva, and different schools of thought, different schools of philosophy originated with their commentaries on these texts. There is another book called the Brahma Sutra or Vyasa Sutras, which brings together some of these statements in the Upanishads which seemingly seem contradictory, and then brings them together and shows how they are in fact in harmony. In other words, this text, what we sometimes might say, does the job of connecting the dots. We might see some two statements in the same Upanishad or in two different Upanishads, which might say like, they don't seem to make sense, or they seem to be mutually contradictory. And so this book called the Brahma Sutra takes all of these passages and shows, no, they are connected. They are in fact in harmony. So there is this one in the Upanishads, a big body of texts. Then there are these Brahma Sutras. Now the Gita is the third such text. And it's because being the best summary of the Vedic wisdom, these three texts, the Upanishads, the Brahma Sutra, and the Gita, are called the three foundational texts of Vedanta. In Sanskrit, they call it Prasthana Traya. And so Gita is very important because it's one of the three foundational texts in Vedanta. And so it would be helpful if I will keep in mind the context of the Gita to approach it with great respect, great reverence, because it is a Shastra, it is a scripture. There is this hymn in which there is this one verse which comes, Sarvopanishado Gavo Dogdha Gopalanandanaha Partho Vatsa Sudhir Bhokta Dugdham Gitamritam Mahat, which simply means Sarvopanishado Gavo, all the Upanishads are cows. Dogdha Gopalanandanaha, and Krishna is milking those cows. Partho Vatsaha. Now we know oftentimes that when you milk the cows, the very first person to get that milk is really the calf. Because until the calf goes, the cow won't start giving milk. But we know if the calf were to drink all of the milk, then nothing will remain for us. But we do drink cow's milk. So the calf drinks as much as it needs, but the cow has a lot more milk to give. And so it says, Partho Vatsaha, Arjuna is that calf. Sudhir Bhokta, people who are spiritually awakened, people who are spiritually conscious, people who are spiritual minded, Bhokta, they are the ones who get to drink this milk. And what is the milk? Gitamritam. It's this nectar, is this life-saving milk. That is the Gita. So the Upanishads, essentially the idea is that it's the same Upanishadic wisdom that is milked by Krishna, first tasted by Arjuna, and then by the rest of us. And so that's the beautiful imagery we find. As I've already said that there are many commentaries on the Gita, and there are two opinions about how we should go about this. One is to study the Gita taking up one or the other commentary, which is also a fine way to do it. The other is, before we go to the commentaries, it's best to kind of approach the main text ourselves and see what it means to us, what it speaks to us. Every text, every teacher, every great saint has a message. And when we hear them, when we try to understand them, it's not necessary that all of their teachings kind of go inside. But depending on our own specific needs, our own life situation, depending on what we are looking for, some aspect of their teaching might suddenly resonate and say, yes, this makes sense. So whatever makes sense to us then that becomes the message we get from that text, from that teaching. And then that message which we get, if we can live according to that message in our daily life, then that message becomes truly ours. And the next time you share that wisdom with somebody else, somebody in your families, your children, or whoever, with your friends, you are then passing on the message that you gave, you're passing it out to others. Now, when they hear you, Again, they may not necessarily like or appreciate everything you said, but maybe something you said maybe resonate with their heart. Then that become the message they got. So that's how the Gita has remained alive. That hundreds and millions of people in every generation have taken this milk of the Gita. Something resonated with them. They tried according to their capacity to live according to those teachings and then passed it on to the next generation in one way or the other. That's how this text is alive even today. It's very ancient, but it's not dead. It's alive because it lives not only in the intellects of people, but in their actually day-to-day life situations. So very, very powerful text. Sri Ramakrishna's words in the Gita are also important. Those who have read his Gospel of Ramakrishna know that once somebody asked him, what is the essential teaching of the Gita? What does the Gita say? That is what sometimes is a kind of in some sense, a lazy question. Because, any text, people say, to read this whole book, can you just tell me briefly what it says so that I won't have to take the trouble to read it myself? And so oftentimes these questions get asked to these great ones. And so Sri Ramakrishna had a wonderful answer to that question. And he would say, repeat Gita 10 times. And what do you get? Saying Gita, 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 Gita. And then, of course, obviously, as you can see, it is Gita, Gita, but it also sounds like Tagi, Tagi, Tagi. And Tagi, according to some Sanskrit grammatical rule, it's actually Tyaga. Tyaga means letting go. And so what Ramakrishna said was, if you want in just one word what the essence of the Gita is, and he says it means let go. Let go of what? Primarily, let go of this ego, this clinging to this little limited personality. So let go of the ego and seek God alone. And by God is meant something that is transcendent, someone who is not simply a part of this perishable world, but an ideal that will stand by me, that will hold me, that will inspire me, that will guide me, even when all this craziness of the world disappears. And one day it will. Everything in the world is perishable. And if all of my time and energy is given to these perishable things around me, a question does come. What happens when all of this perishes? What remains with me? Because everything of mine I've given to this perishable thing, and boom, it's gone. So it's good to then reserve at least some part of our time, our energy, our interest, our hopes to something that is not perishable. And so that is what Ramakrishna meant, that let go of clinging to this little I, find that real I, that infinite I, the non-perishable I. And one final comment. There is a popular idea about the Gita. As I said in the beginning, it's a narration that Sanjaya, who was one of the persons on the Kaurava side, who narrates it to the blind king. So the king is blind, he is old, he hasn't gone to the battle. He is in this capital, Hastinapur, just waiting to get the news. No internet that time, no live commentary, nothing was possible. So he just has to wait for somebody to bring the news. There is a popular misconception, even from people who have read the Gita, as if the Gita is some kind of a live commentary. That Sanjaya is sitting near this blind king and telling him exactly what is happening on this distant battlefield. Those of you who have seen that television version of the Mahabharata, now sometimes they'll have this kind of almost like a big TV screen on the wall, and the battle is occurring here, and this Sanjaya is narrating it to the king. Don't believe that. That's not true. If you go to the original text, it's not a live commentary. So the battle, I think, lasted for 18 days. And it's on the 10th day of the war. So the commander-in-chief on the Kaurava side was Bhishma. So on the 10th day, Bhishma falls down. So Arjuna's arrows bring him down. And so now your main commander-in-chief now is down. And so the Sanjaya runs back to the king to then let him know that this is the big development that has occurred on the battlefield. So really this narration of the Gita occurs when the battle has already started and 10 days have already been gone. And so therefore, if you see, and as we'll see next week, the very first verse, that's the only time Dhritarashtra opens his mouth, when he asks, what did my children on the battlefield, what did they do? Look, it's in the past tense. If it were running commentary, he would say, what are they doing now? What are you seeing? But it's actually in the past tense. What did they do? Everything that Sanjaya narrates, it's also in the past. So he's narrating what he has, a direct eyewitness account, because he was on the battlefield, of what he saw. So that context is to be kept in the mind. So now I will read just a few verses from this hymn called the Gita Mahatmyam, the glory of the Gita. It's a kind of a meditation on the Gita. Some of the Gita texts might have it, some may not have it. It's not something that we are going to study in detail, but it's good to begin the study of the Gita by this meditative verses on it. And as I've already mentioned to you earlier, and I can mention it again, feel free to bring any edition of the Gita that you may have at home. I intend to just make a free translation of it from the original Sanskrit as we go about. Don't worry if your translation uses some different words or a different phrase, because we are not going to get hung up with specific turn of phrases or words. We will go to the original Sanskrit itself and see what is the meaning that comes to us. So bring any copy of the Gita that you like. And as I said, that in case you don't have a copy of the Gita, or if you want to see what other options are available, the bookstore here has some 2 or 3 good versions of the Gita. So pick up any version from anywhere and come when you come next time. So I'll just read through these few verses of the Gita meditation. I'll read the Sanskrit, then I'll read the translation. I'm doing it from this book by Swami Swarupananda. Om Parthaya Pratibodhitam Bhagavata Narayanena Swayam Vyasena Krathitam Purana Munina Madhye Mahabharatam Advaitamrita Varshinim Bhagavatim Ashtadashadhyayinim Ambatvam Anusandadhami Bhagavat Gite Bhavatveshinim. O Bhagavad Gita, with which Partha was enlightened by the Lord Narayana himself, and which was incorporated in the Mahabharata by the ancient sage Vyasa, the Blessed Mother, the destroyer of rebirth, showering down the nectar of Advaita and consisting of 18 chapters, upon thee, O Bhagavad Gita, O loving Mother, I meditate. Namostu te vyasa vishala buddhe pullara vinda yatapatra netra yena tvaya bharata taila purnaha prajvalito jnanamaya pradipaha. Salutations to thee, O Vyasa, of mighty intellect and with eyes large like the petals of a full-blown lotus, by whom was lighted the lamp of wisdom full of the Mahabharata oil. Prapanna parijataya totra vaitraika panaye jnanamudraya krishnaya gitamritaduhe namaha. Salutation to Krishna, the holder of the Jnanamudra, granter of desire of those who take refuge in him, the milker of the Gita nectar, in whose hand is the cane for driving cows. And then the verse which we saw earlier, Sarvopanishado gavo dogdha gopala nandanaha partho vatsas sudhir bhokta dugdham gitamritam mahat. All the Upanishads are the cows. The son of the cowherd is the milker. Partha is the calf. Men of purified intellect are the drinkers, and the supreme nectar Gita is the milk. Vasudeva sutam devam kamsa chanura mardanam devaki paramanandam krishnam vande jagadgurum. I salute Krishna, the Guru of the universe, God, the son of Vasudeva, the destroyer of Kamsa and Chanura, the supreme bliss of Devaki. And so on it goes. I'll just read one more verse. Mukam karoti vachalam pangum langhayate girim yat kripa tamaham vande paramananda madhavam. I salute that all bliss Madhava, whose compassion makes the mute eloquent and the cripple cross mountains. So this gives you some idea about the high reverence with which this text has been seen. So as we begin the study, let's keep this at the back of the mind, that this is not being done simply to enlarge our intellectual horizon. It will, of course, but more importantly, that it is something that can show us guidance even today, and one kind of a commitment we can make to ourselves. If the Gita is to be a life-changing experience, that we will not keep it simply as at the intellectual level. And that's for those who want to do a scholarship on the Gita, write books on the Gita, do a PhD thesis on the Gita, can do that. But if our goal is to change our life, change our consciousness, to become better, go closer to God, then we don't have to accept anything blindly. If something doesn't make sense, we don't have to accept it. But if something does make sense, if something does ring true, if something does resonate with the head and heart, then let's not simply say, oh yeah, that's good, that's a great idea, that's wonderful, and then go about our life as if nothing has happened. If something is true, if something has the ring of authenticity to it, then the next question each one of us has to ask is, if this is true, how does it impact my life? How can I put it into practice? Because if something is true, there is no point in delaying and saying, oh yeah, it's true, but I'll start practicing next year. We don't even know. We don't know what's going to happen next day. So if something is true, we need to say, I'm going to start practicing it immediately. Now, some of the things we might find may ring true, may not have any immediate relevance to our life at present, which is completely fine. But if we hold on to this insight, maybe after 2 years, maybe after 5 years, maybe after 10 years, we come across some situation in life and say, yes, I read this in the Gita, now I know what to do. And so these things are very precious. And so if we approach it with that reverence, that faith, we will learn and benefit a lot from this text. So I'll stop here, but if you have any immediate questions or thoughts, feel free to share them. Yeah, Vikram?
Swamiji. Swamiji, are there different commentaries of the Gita that take a dualist or non-dualist perspective?
Oh, sure, yeah. And that's kind of natural. They don't start by thinking, this is the perspective I'm going to take. Essentially, commentaries are nothing but, I would say, loud thinking in some ways. That is, when Shankaracharya read the text, when Ramanuja read it, when they read it, what was the meaning that was revealed to them? Because everything that we read, everything that we try to understand, gets filtered through our mind. And our minds are not just clean slates. our minds are already conditioned by our past experiences, our own unique way of looking and understanding. And it's through these kind of, you might say, little bit of colored lenses of our mind, everything we are taking in. And so everything that is taken in kind of becomes our own. It's a little bit like when you download a software, there is always this you go first to the settings menu, and say, how can I best make it something that will be useful to me as I use this app? So all of this teaching is a little bit like that, because all of us are unique people. No two amongst us has exactly identical life situation. Our needs are different. Our approaches are different. The way we understand is different. So these teachings, when we take in, we are going to respond to it in many different ways. And therefore, the way Shankara's mind responded to it took the form of Shankaracharya's commentary, and so on. And so all of us may not write commentaries of our own, but if we ever decide, just even in your own private journal, to say, I'm going to write down, as I read this verse, this is the meaning that comes to me, then maybe that becomes your commentary on the Gita. And if it is beneficial to you, maybe it might become beneficial to somebody else.Maybe then you can write and publish your commentary. Maybe we can have so many budding acharyas here. And I'm not joking. Thing is this, there is no such thing as right or wrong in this. It's that this is how my mind is processing it. The only way to think in terms of right and wrong, and that traditional view would be this. If my interpretation in any form or way contradicts the Upanishads, then they're saying it's wrong. Then, because no one can say, I know better than the Upanishad. If someone says it, that person better look out. So, other than that, so long as we are not contradicting the Upanishads, you can say, this is how my mind is processing it. And so long as it helps me become a better person, so long as it takes me nearer to God, who is to say whether it's right or wrong? That's the idea. Yeah.
Maharaj, I really want to study Gita, so I want to know how I should come to this class, because I feel that Arjuna is within me, Duryodhana is within me. I have to find the Krishna within me who can guide me to be. So that's the mind setup. Should I bring it?
Absolutely. That's actually a beautiful way to look at it. There's both Krishna here and Arjuna and Duryodhana. And I want this Krishna, this higher awakened part of my mind, to be teaching this confused part of my mind, which is what the state of Arjuna was. There is a story in the Native American tradition. This one grandfather is telling his grandson, he says that I often feel that there are two wolves in me. One of the wolves is very positive, healthy, goodness, represent goodness and greatness. And the other wolf inside is evil, wants to be destructive, wants to do terrible things. And these two wolves in my mind are always fighting with one another. And then the little grandchild asks, but Grandpa, which of the wolves will win ultimately? The grandfather says, whichever you feed. So we have both. There's both Arjuna is here and Duryodhana also there. So if I give more encouragement to the Arjuna in my heart, then Arjuna will be ready to receive Krishna's teaching. If I give more encouragement to the Duryodhana part of my personality, then Duryodhana never got to hear the Gita in the battlefield. And so we will maybe reading a book, but yet not hearing it. So I think that's a very good way to look at it. Yeah. Any other? Yes.
The very opening of the Bhagavad Gita itself, Dhritarashtra Vaja. And if we understand who is Dhritarashtra, he is a blind person. That could be me.
And not
So
could be.
if we
are.
start from there and then try and absorb the teaching, I find that method really cascaded many hidden treasures that was there in Bhagavad Gita.
Good. Yeah, I think I like
The
that.
moment I know everything is gone. If I approach as Dhritarashtra, I am a blind man. What
Yeah,
happens?
you made the point. So that's a good point that, please sit down.
Thank
That, that every one of us, we can think about Duryodhana, but we can also think that there is Dhritarashtra inside, that just as Dhritarashtra is seen as a blind king, and to the extent that we are blind to this reality of the divine within us, the Dhritarashtra also lives inside us. That's a very good point. Yeah. Okay, so we will stop here today, and when we meet next Wednesday, we will begin with Dhritarashtra's, the very first verse. So we'll begin that next Wednesday. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Muhuhum.